Hey fam, welcome back to another video. This is Amanda the author, and today we are talking about world building, specifically world building in modern fantasy. Now you might be thinking when you hear world building that it's only for the girls who are doing epic fantasy, some Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones type stuff. And I'm sorry to tell you that even if you're writing modern fantasy, i.e. fantasy set in the modern world, or at least in the world as we know it, you still have to do some world building. But don't be afraid. Today I have 5 tips to help you make your world building shine, and I will also be going into some of the definitions of the different type of modern fantasy because there's a lot and you might be confused just as I was before I looked these definitions up. If you like this type of content, writing tips, and all things fantasy, go ahead and subscribe to my channel now because that is me. That's all the things I'll be talking about, and even if you're not an author, you might learn a little something from this video. So stick around and let's get started. So before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about why I like writing modern fantasy. I've always been interested in it. Even as a kid, I would gravitate towards the books, movies, and shows that had magic sprinkled in with our world as we knew it, a little magic mixed with the mundane, if you will. And as I started getting older and as I started writing, that's the type of content I started to really enjoy writing. Like I said, blending the magic and the mundane, having a little ghost or werewolf happening as somebody's pumping gas right after work. I like those scenarios and I think that they're fun, and I think it adds a lot of opportunity for some tension between the magic and the mundane or our world. So that's why I like writing modern fantasy. And in fact, my modern fantasy series, Witchkind, has 2 books out already that are set in 2022 and in modern day America. The first book, To Stare with Love, came out last year, and the second book, To Ilaris and Desperation, came out just yesterday. So you have 2 books that you can read if you want to learn a little bit more about that world. So now that you know a little bit about me, let's talk a little bit about some of the definitions of modern fantasy. Modern fantasy fits under the speculative fiction umbrella, and it is a subsection, like I said, of fantasy, and it is also known as low fantasy, whereas epic fantasy, like I mentioned, your Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, things like that, are known as high fantasy. So modern fantasy is low fantasy, and underneath the modern low fantasy definition, there are several subsections just to that subsection. You might have heard the terms urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, even magical realism, and you might be wondering what's the difference between all of them? Are they all modern fantasy? And generally, yes. I have a few definitions for you so that it'll be easier for you to identify what you're writing, and that way you can hone in on your audience. If you're going the traditional route, you can hone in on the right agent. And also, if you're going the self-published route, it'll be easier for you to add the proper tags to your book when you add it on Amazon so that you're not saying that your book is magical realism when it actually falls more into the urban fantasy camp. So here are a few definitions for you. Now, urban fantasy, that's probably the most widely used definition that we have out there. Now, urban fantasy is the type of fantasy that features fantastical characters and concepts that are placed in a real world setting, often in an urban or city type of environment. You generally would not classify a story taking place in a rural area as urban, just because the word urban kind of connotates that it's a city setting. Then there's contemporary fantasy, which is just fantasy that takes place in the modern world in the modern era. So things that are happening like now, or just very shortly in the future. So next year, things like that. Again, if this contemporary fantasy takes place in a big city, then it is considered urban fantasy. Next, there's magical realism, and magical realism is a type of fantasy and also a type of realism, so it's considered kind of both fantasy but also realism, like literary, that blurs the line between fantasy and reality. It's that type of content that has that undercurrent of fantasy weave throughout the story. And with magical realism, that magic is considered a part of the everyday normal world. It's usually pretty commonplace. Unlike, say, urban fantasy, where you might have the fantasy that's a little more tucked away and hidden, like underground in that way. Dark fantasy is a type of fantasy that can be found either in the high or low subgenre, and it is characterized by fantasy that often has a bit of a horror element to it. There's a kind of a general sense of dread, a bit of an atmospheric thing. You know, you've got hauntings or anything like that. Along with fantastical is considered dark fantasy. Finally, the last definition I will be including is grimdark. This is a type of fantasy that kind of blurs the line a bit between like modern fantasy and, any kind of futuristic thing, because usually grimdark is characterized by content that has dystopian or is particularly violent or realistic, and that's why I lumped it here into the modern fantasy category. Now that we have those fantasy definitions out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about what world building actually is. Just hearing world building, you might be thinking, oh, I'm only talking about setting up the area, the setting of your story, what world it's on, or a spaceship, or anything like that. And that's not strictly what it is. It actually is more granular than that. So world building also means that you are deciding and planning the fantastical elements of your book. If you have, let's say, witches, what is their magic system? What kind of rules govern their coven, their witchdom? If there are vampires, do they go out in the sunlight? Do they drink blood? Are they energy vampires? You're also talking and thinking about those kind of rules. Additionally, if there are fantastical elements weaved into, let's say, a governing body, what would those laws look like? As an example, in my Witchkind series, the President of the United States is a vampire, and everybody knows about vampires. They've come out of the coffin, much like True Blood. So when I created this book, I had to decide upfront what I wanted the vampires to be like. Did I want them to be classic and not go outside and be affected by garlic and crosses? I had to decide, being that this was the President of the United States, I had to research a lot on American politics and laws and things like that, and then decide if I was a vampire president, what kind of laws would I pass to ensure protection of my people? Witches also exist in this world, and so that was another element that I had to world build, deciding what their magic system was like, deciding the fact that they are known by humans, what that looked like, and deciding what laws, if any, would affect them. So that's just a few examples of what world building could look like in a modern fantasy setting. Now, again, if you're writing modern fantasy, you might be wondering, that's cool and all, but why does this actually matter? How does this apply to me? Now, even if you're the type of writer who pantses their stuff, right? You write by the seat of your pants. It is still important to do a little bit of that groundwork ahead of time and do at least a little bit of world building before you start writing. That way you don't paint yourself into a corner, or you don't start writing and asking questions that you don't have the answer to. So, world building, especially modern fantasy, can help make sure that your story is airtight, that there's no inconsistencies which would take your reader out of the story. It helps further flesh out your characters, especially if they are fantastical, and it can ensure that you properly convey all of those fantastical elements in your book. It's important that you do this so that your readers are not taken out of the story. How many times have you watched a movie, read a book, seen a TV show that is modern fantasy and there's inconsistencies, or the world building just really doesn't make any sense, especially for the type of fantastical being that's included? It sucks, right? It takes you out of the story. You don't want to do that with your readers, so world building ahead of time will help you avoid those pitfalls. Now it's time for my 5 tips that will help you and your world building shine. My first tip is do your research. So you're setting your book in modern times. What segment of modern society are you setting it in? Are there politics involved? Is it a marketing agency? Is it rural South? In order for you to have your book rooted in any kind of reality, you have to do your research, especially if it's a type of society or subculture or genre or level of government, anything that you don't know anything about. Like I mentioned, for my Witchkind series, I'm not a political science major. I had to do a ton of research into modern American politics, how laws are passed, how bills are passed, how they get from one part of the government to another, what happens if Supreme Court justices pass away, when the midterms occur, when a president gives his presidential address, so on and so forth. It was a lot of research, and I did it ahead of time so that when I started writing, I didn't stop mid-sentence and then go on a research rabbit hole to find that answer. One thing I've been seeing a lot of authors now thinking about and grappling with is the decision to include our current situation, the panorama that we are in your book. That's something you can decide to do or not. I started writing my series in 2018, so I did not include it even in the second book, which I started writing last year, but that's something also to consider. Regardless if you decide to include it or not, it's still important to take into account all of the things that's happened in our world thus far. So if you have a cast of characters who really like music, what's playing on the radio? What are they going to be listening to? If they're Gen Zers, they're probably going to be more interested in TikTok than in Twitter. These may not sound like your classic world building things, but they are, because it's helping you to flesh out your characters and the worlds that they are living in. And when you add your fantastical element, that's another moment for you to start doing your research. Like I mentioned, my books have vampires and witches. So I did a lot of research on classic vampire lore, classic vampire do's and don'ts, if you will. Sunlight and garlic and crosses and, draining bodies and things like that. I did a lot of research, went down a lot of rabbit holes on vampire lore, really truly to decide what I wanted to include. Same thing with witches. I did a lot of research on witchcraft, a lot of deep dives into the different magic systems around the world to really then decide what I wanted to do for my magic system. Now that you've done your research, it's time to start the actual world building. The first thing that I like to do, and the first thing I recommend, is you look at your setting. What is happening in the outside world? That could be the location of where your whip takes place. That could be the things that are happening externally. If you are writing a modern fantasy, are you going to include current events? Are you going to include Brexit or Donald Trump or things like that? Deciding those things will really help with not only the setting and atmosphere of your book, but it will influence your characters because they will have some type of opinion and worldview on the things that have happened in the world thus far. Additionally, this is where, because you're writing fantasy, you can start to play a little bit with the details and weave in those fantastic elements. As an example, in my Witchkind series, there are boutique blood bars. Essentially, vampires, because they are out in the open, have opened their own bars to enjoy their fresh blood in peace. There's also magic shops, there's also magic tattoo parlor that my character's father runs, and I establish all of these things in this phase. This is also where you establish the different laws that affect your characters. As I mentioned previously, all of the standard regular laws that affect humans are on the books in my book. The only additions that I've added are laws that specifically affect vampires, such as not being able to drain people's blood without consent, and the laws that affect witches, such as them not being able to practice magic out in public. Regardless if you are writing something that involves governing bodies, like our government, or you're writing something in a small town that just affects a handful of people who make their own rules, this is the part that you start to establish those laws, and that will inform your character's worldview, opinion, and everything else, which you will then refine when you establish your interior world. Now, when you start to build your interior world, as I like to call it, this is where you're really refining the rules for your fantastical elements specifically, and not just the world that affects your book at large, right? Your other potentially non-fantastical characters. This is also where you would do a bit of your magic system building, and I plan to do a whole video on building a magic system, so stay tuned for that. But in addition to the magic system building that you would do, this is where we're talking about those rules, like I mentioned, that affect your fantastical characters specifically. So here are a few examples. In the show Charmed, right? The witches cannot do magic for personal gain. In the show American Horror Story even, when you die on a property, your soul or ghost is trapped there. In my Witchkind series, witches can only use magic from their specific element because the magic is elemental. Therefore, if you are somebody whose guiding element is air, then you are only able to use powers that align or come from that element. So in my main character, Mercury's case, he's an air hand and his primary powers are telekinesis, psychometry, and he has enhanced senses. My third tip, which should be the easiest thing, is that hopefully the settings and the laws and the things you've established in the real world may clash with the things that you've established when you lay down the rules for your fantastical world. That will add some tension to your book, and it could potentially be your core tension, right? How many witchy shows and books have we read where magic must be hidden and kept under wraps, and the main character, or even a side character, falls in love with somebody non-magical? There's that tension there of them keeping true to their magical identity and keeping their magic hidden and secret, but also wanting to share everything with the person that they are falling in love with. My final tip is perhaps the most important one, and that is be consistent. When you are establishing rules, no matter if it's with a magic system, with your ghosts, your vampires, your werewolves, your demons, your angels, your fairies, your regular, digular, schmegular humans, it's important to remain consistent. As I mentioned at the top, inconsistencies can take your readers out of the story and will sometimes cause them to not want to come back. So if you say that, to use a Charmed example, your characters cannot use magic for personal gain, and then they do, and then there's no consequence, you've broken one of your own world building rules, and you don't want to do that. So when it comes to your world building, it's important to keep it in a separate document, in a separate and accessible area. That way you can refer to it while you're writing, and especially when you're doing rewrites. For me, I write in Google Docs, and I have a whole separate document just with my world building, with the rules, with information about the magic system, with some of my research, and I'm constantly referring to it as I'm writing, and especially when I've done my rewrites, I've referred to it just to make sure that I'm consistent. So let's recap. My 5 tips to help you in your world building when it comes to your modern fantasy are this. Do your research. Make sure that you know everything you can about the setting that your book takes place in, especially if it is someplace different than where you live. Know everything about the different things that your characters are into. If you're somebody who's a metalhead and your character really loves hip hop, you're probably going to want to do your research. Additionally, do your research on the fantastical elements of your book. As an example, the current book I'm writing, my main character is a necromancer. And I didn't know anything really about necromancy before I started writing. So I did a ton of research. I read other content that featured necromancers so that I had a better idea of what this type of magic was. Once you've done your research and you feel like you're able to start plotting, then start with your exterior or outer world, i.e. the setting and the different laws that govern the overarching system. So that could be, setting your book in Los Angeles, which might have different city laws than, say, New York. And here is where, if you're going to write something and rewrite some of those laws or play around with the setting, i.e. add a boutique blood bar or add a couple hipster bookstores or a tattoo parlor in Venice Beach, then this is where you would do it. Then after you establish your exterior world, then you start to establish your interior world. And by that I mean the fantastical world that you are establishing in this book. So this is where you would really start to build out your magic system if your book had one, the werewolf clan that you're writing, your vampire coven, and all of the things and rules that they have to abide by, and all of the things and rules that they want to break. The next tip was to make sure that there's a little bit of tension between the rules that are established by the outside, or i.e. human world, and the rules established or that govern your fantastical world. Using the example again, if you have a witch character who is not supposed to tell anybody about her magic and ends up falling in love with somebody who isn't magic, it doesn't have to be a human, it could be a vampire, it could be a ghost, it could be anything. How does that add some tension? You can explore that, and that can help add a little more tension to your story. The final rule is to be consistent. Consistency over everything, even if as you're writing, you're still doing some research, or you're changing things around, or maybe you decide that you don't want your vampires to walk in the daylight in the 3rd chapter, you can always go back. Regardless, be consistent. If you say in chapter 1 that your vampires are energy vampires and they have no thirst for blood, don't in chapter 6 make your vampires suddenly want to slurp on a human. That is, unless this is a different sect of vampires, in which case explain that. When you're inconsistent in your world building, that could take your readers out of the story that you're trying to tell, and you don't want that. You want them to be as invested as possible, so making sure that you're consistent, constantly referring back to your world building documents or dossier, or even your world building book Bible, which I know a couple authors have that, will really help you with that consistency. And if it's too anxiety inducing to do it while you're writing, you can always do that while you're doing your rewrite, so that you can go back over it with a fine-tooth comb and check for that consistency that you should be maintaining. Well, I hope y'all enjoyed this video about world building in modern fantasy. What's going on with me? I just published a book yesterday. To Ilaris and Desperation came out yesterday. It is the sequel to Stare with Love, and I'm really happy and excited for y'all to read it. You can get an ebook or a paperback if you go to Amazon, or if you go to the Melanin Library, which is a library specifically featuring Black authors, where you can go get your book and support both Black authors and a Black-owned business. So make sure you do that. I'll put a link in the description for you to access that. Additionally, I will be speaking to Fifth House Collective, which is a book box that specifically supports indie authors and comic book artists and businesses, and showcases their work in a monthly book box. To Stare with Love is featured in a book box last year, and To Ilaris and Desperation will be featured in this month's book box for Fifth House Collective. I will be chatting with the lovely co-owner and co-founder of Fifth House Collective, Samara Hill, on Sunday here on my YouTube channel at 7 p.m. EST, 4 p.m. PST. So if you want to join us, where we're going to chat about my Witchkind series, To Ilaris and Desperation, how Fifth House Collective started, and all the wonderful things they are doing both for indie authors and for their local community, please join and leave a comment and let us know that you're there. Once again, thank you so much for checking out this video. Thanks for subscribing if you've subscribed, and if you haven't, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. You won't be disappointed, especially if you are into all things fantasy. Even if you're not an author, you can still learn a little something something. So, have a good evening, stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Bye! We're going to be talking about... What are we talking about? Now it's... No. Things that have to do with fantasy, all things fantasy, both when they... So stay tuned for that, and go ahead and subscribe so you'll be notified. It is usually, it's a type of horror that... Hold on. It's a city setting. Then there's contemporary fantasy, which is, I think, a newer definition, which is a kind of a newer way of... Then dark fantasy, take a breath, that your world can help make sure that your... Now, dark fantasy can be found either in the high or low fantasy subgenres. Now, my third tip is to do this build, I like the word, what am I saying? So I had to